The autumn fog over eastern France hung low enough to brush the helmets of the soldiers moving through it, turning the entire valley into a shifting curtain of pale grey. At first glance, nothing in this landscape suggested that anything unusual was happening. Yet for the German observers stationed along the ridgeline above the Meuse, something didn't add up. Through their field glasses, they watched long lines of American troops advance with a level of steadiness they were not accustomed to seeing from newly arrived forces. These weren't the hesitant movements typical of inexperienced units. Instead, the Americans seemed almost unnervingly confident as they crossed open ground, raising their rifles with an efficiency that made several officers exchange concerned comments. The question moved quietly from trench to trench. How are they doing this? What the Germans were witnessing that morning in 1918 wasn't a miracle, and it wasn't a mystery to the people inside the American ranks. For months leading up to this offensive, the United States Army had trained its infantry in a way that diverged dramatically from European convention. Where many armies placed emphasis on tight drills and synchronized volleys, the Americans approached marksmanship as a personal skill, something every soldier had to internalize until aiming, firing, and correcting became almost automatic. It wasn't simply about hitting distant targets. It was about cultivating the ability to make split-second decisions under pressure, using judgment and instinct shaped through thousands of repetitions. At the center of this transformation was a system that blended frontier culture with formal training. Many American recruits arrived already familiar with rifles, having practiced on farms, in open fields, or during hunting seasons back home. They weren't strangers to wind, distance, or the subtle adjustments needed to place a shot accurately. But the Army sharpened these skills further. Instruction focused on natural movement, individual initiative, and rapid engagement of targets at unpredictable angles. The goal was not to create mechanical shooters but adaptable ones, the kind who could read a battlefield as easily as someone reads the lines of their own hands. Among these troops was Private Samuel Kerr, a young man from Colorado whose upbringing had been shaped by long days outdoors. He had grown up navigating hillsides, tracking small game, and practicing careful control of his rifle while learning from his father, who believed that awareness and discipline mattered more than brute force. When Kerr enlisted, he carried these habits with him. What he didn't expect was that the Army would take these instincts and develop them into something far more precise. In the months before deployment, Kerr and his fellow soldiers experienced a kind of immersive education that stretched them physically and mentally. They learned not only how to manage recoil or maintain their weapon, but how to calm their breathing in tense moments, how to snap their rifle to their shoulder smoothly, and how to trust their own judgment instead of waiting for rigid commands. By late 1918, the American Expeditionary Forces were putting this training into practice on a massive scale. As they continued their advance, German soldiers took note of how quickly American riflemen reacted. Instead of pausing in confusion when confronted with sudden resistance, they shifted positions naturally, taking advantage of cover and adjusting their aim with a calmness that struck many observers as unusual. Reports began filtering through German lines describing young Americans who moved with the self-assurance of seasoned veterans. Officers in the German trenches found themselves reassessing assumptions they had held for years about inexperienced troops, assumptions that were now proving unreliable. The rapid progress of American units wasn't solely due to their weapons or numbers. It was their ability to make accurate shots under stressful conditions that repeatedly disrupted enemy defenses. German positions designed to hold for hours were sometimes compromised in minutes, not because of overwhelming fire but because of precise, well-timed actions that opened gaps in the line. The growing realization among German commanders was unsettling. They were up against soldiers who understood how to seize initiative. Private Kern noticed this dynamic firsthand. During one advance through a wooded ravine, he and his squad encountered small groups of German riflemen positioned behind fallen trees. Instead of stopping or waiting for extensive orders, Kerr reacted instinctively. He shifted his stance, sighted briefly, and placed shots where they needed to go, creating an opening for his squad to continue forward. These moments were not dramatic on their own, but across the entire front, thousands of similar instances created a cumulative effect that shifted momentum in favor of the American forces. Observers later described scenes in which German troops, expecting to face cautious advances, instead found themselves dealing with opponents who closed distances quickly, made decisions independently, and applied their training with remarkable consistency. The pace of the American advance became a subject of analysis within German headquarters, where officers questioned how such recently arrived forces could act with such coherence. The answer lay in the blend of upbringing and structured training, the merging of frontier habits and new military doctrine into one cohesive approach. To the soldiers experiencing it, this shift was both empowering and surprising. Many of them hadn't realized how their previous experiences prepared them for these moments. For Kerr, moving through the French countryside felt strangely familiar. The shapes of trees, the angles of hilltops, and the way sound traveled through open fields reminded him of home. This sense of recognition allowed him to stay calm, even when the environment demanded quick decisions. He found himself navigating the battlefield using instincts shaped long before he ever wore a uniform, now refined by the guidance of instructors who emphasized control and clarity. The longer the campaign continued, the more evident it became that the American approach to developing individual skill was creating results far beyond initial expectations. Officers noticed that when units reached difficult terrain or encountered unexpected resistance, soldiers like Kerr responded with improvisation instead of hesitation. They didn't wait for someone else to act. They assessed the situation and chose the best available option. While this flexibility sometimes surprised commanders, it repeatedly led to positive outcomes that kept operations moving forward. Meanwhile, German accounts revealed a growing sense of concern. Some reports described American riflemen as unusually deliberate, capable of adjusting their aim mid-movement or responding to fleeting opportunities in ways that felt daunting to opponents. Stories spread of American units advancing through areas considered too challenging for inexperienced troops. Instead of slowing, they found ways to adapt, weaving their training into every action. It wasn't about fearlessness, it was about familiarity with the tasks at hand. As the fog lifted gradually that morning, both armies became fully engaged, and the scale of the conflict expanded. Yet even as visibility improved and the broader battlefield took shape, the Germans remained puzzled by how effectively the Americans maintained their rhythm. What had begun as small observations from ridgetop lookouts evolved into a larger realization. These soldiers were not approaching combat with the same expectations as their European counterparts. Hidden within their coordinated movements was an understanding that each soldier carried responsibility for the space around them. This concept, which had been emphasized repeatedly during training, encouraged initiative in ways that broke from older traditions. It allowed troops to respond fluidly to shifting conditions and help them maintain momentum even when terrain, weather, or resistance threatened to slow them down. For Kerr and his fellow riflemen, this mindset wasn't something they had consciously analyzed. It was simply the way they had been taught to operate. As the front expanded and the day unfolded, the Americans continued pushing forward with the same composed determination that had caught German attention in the first place. The foundation for this confidence had been established long before they reached France, through countless hours of training that polished natural abilities into something consistent and dependable. The combination of personal experience, methodical instruction, and the adaptability demanded by the environment created a new standard of performance that signaled a shift in how infantry could operate in modern conflict. The steady push of the American lines created a ripple effect that traveled far beyond the immediate area of the advance. Messages from German forward positions continued to arrive at command posts with the same puzzling details. The Americans were moving as if they had rehearsed the terrain in advance. Instead of pausing uncertainly at obstacles, they navigated them with a sense of timing that German officers struggled to categorize. Their opponents seemed to view each unexpected challenge not as a disruption but as an opportunity to apply their training in real time. Higher-ranking observers inside the German command structure attempted to make sense of these reports. They compared notes from different sectors and found consistent patterns. In several areas, American riflemen appeared to act in unplanned harmony, adjusting their spacing, angles, and focus without requiring lengthy shouted instructions. Some German officers theorized that American units were equipped with new technology, perhaps optical equipment or communication tools that allowed them to coordinate more quickly than expected. But when captured equipment was examined, the conclusion was surprising. Everything the Americans carried was standard, nothing beyond what any ordinary infantryman used. What the German analysts were missing was that the Americans had prioritized a philosophy rather than a gadget. Instead of teaching soldiers to wait rigidly for centralized control, instructors had emphasized the value of reading the environment and acting upon it. They instilled a sense of quiet confidence that encouraged small decisions made at the individual level, trusting that 1,000 well-informed adjustments would support the greater objective. To an outsider, this approach looked spontaneous, but it was the product of patient instruction and a culture shaped by generations of independent problem-solving. Private Kerr felt this difference each time his squad encountered a new stretch of terrain. During one afternoon advance across a sloping field bordered by hedgerows, he noticed subtle shifts in the ground, tiny dips, scattered stones, and narrow pockets of exposed soil where wind had brushed aside fallen leaves. While others focused on distant movement, Kerr interpreted the terrain like a familiar trail. When he motioned for his squad to angle slightly left to avoid a natural funnel between two risers, his sergeant didn't stop to question him. The squad responded immediately, trusting that each member had the awareness to recognize patterns the others might not see. As the unit continued, bursts of distant rifle fire echoed from the ridge ahead. Instead of freezing or waiting for formal signals, the squad instinctively spread out. Kerr steadied his breathing, positioned his rifle, and identified movement through the trees. In training, instructors had emphasized that the goal was not simply to fire but to understand when not to fire, to find the angle that provided clarity rather than guesswork. Kerr held his focus for a moment longer before acting, and the squad advanced with the same measured confidence that had become their hallmark. The deeper the Americans pushed into German-held territory, the more evident it became that their training wasn't producing isolated moments of excellence but a continuous stream of small, correct decisions. Each choice, how to move, when to pause, where to place attention, built upon the one before it. The consistency impressed even their own officers, who found themselves adjusting their planning to capitalize on the reliability of their riflemen. Stories spread among American units about similar experiences across the front. Soldiers shared observations about how their instincts seemed sharper than they had anticipated. Some attributed this to their upbringing, recalling how much time they had spent outdoors long before joining the army. Others credited the exhaustive training that taught them to make calm, steady adjustments regardless of pressure. The combination of natural familiarity with rifles and structured instruction created a dynamic in which even relatively young soldiers could handle complex situations with ease. As the American advance continued, German officers increasingly shifted their focus from equipment to behavior. They studied how American soldiers used cover, how they selected vantage points, and how they communicated through small gestures rather than loud commands. One officer reportedly described them as practiced improvisers, an unusual term for opponents typically portrayed as inexperienced. Yet that phrase captured something essential. The Americans weren't following a rigid script, they were applying a set of principles that allowed them to adapt continuously. For Kerr, the momentum of these early operations reinforced his trust in the training he had received. During brief pauses between engagements, he often thought back to the long sessions on the practice range, where instructors emphasized mindful repetition. They taught soldiers to break down each action into deliberate, controlled movements, not to speed through them but to execute them so consistently that stress would never draw them off balance. It was this steadiness that now guided Kerr through each shifting moment on the front. On one occasion, his squad approached a small hillside village where narrow lanes curved unpredictably between stone houses. The area was quiet, but the stillness didn't feel reassuring. German units often used such layouts to slow advances, placing observers in elevated positions. Instead of walking directly into the central lane, Kerr suggested circling around a low wall that offered a better vantage point of the upper windows. The squad followed, moving quietly along the outer path. From this angle, they spotted subtle movement behind a shutter. A direct approach would have placed them within view long before they had time to react. But by using terrain and awareness, they approached with an advantage. The squad communicated with a series of small gestures, confirming observation, adjusting positions, and maintaining calm control. When movement from the upper floor became clearer, they responded with the same composed timing that had characterized their earlier actions. Each of these engagements, though small in scale, reflected a broader shift occurring within the American forces. Soldiers were no longer entering situations with the mindset of waiting for perfect instructions. They were approaching problems with the same practicality many had learned in their personal lives, the kind that developed naturally through farm work, outdoor navigation, or hands-on challenges. The Army had simply given structure and purpose to these instincts, aligning them with operational goals. As news of American successes spread among the Allied leadership, confidence in their abilities continued to grow. Officers observed the progress with a mixture of pride and curiosity, noting how quickly the new arrival of American manpower translated into meaningful results. The transformation of recruits into highly capable riflemen in such a short time became a subject of discussion within headquarters, prompting senior staff to look deeper into the methods behind the training system. Meanwhile, German observers found themselves confronting a growing paradox. The Americans were newcomers to the European theater, yet their composure and timing suggested seasoned familiarity with the challenges of the front. German analysts increasingly remarked that these troops seemed to excel not because of unusual technology but because of their mindset, a characteristic far harder to counter. To the men in the American lines, this rising reputation was not something they actively cultivated. Soldiers like Kerr simply applied what they had learned, moving forward with a calmness shaped by repetition and guided by a sense of steady responsibility. They continued to push through fields, forests, and rolling hillsides with quiet determination, unaware of how profoundly their actions were altering the expectations of armies accustomed to different rhythms of battle. And as the operations expanded, the Germans slowly realized that the Americans were not just participating in the final campaign of the war, they were quietly redefining what well-trained infantry could achieve when given both skill and trust. The further the American lines moved into contested territory, the more pronounced this difference became. In areas where other forces might have slowed due to uncertainty about what lay ahead, the Americans seemed almost energized by the challenge. They approached unfamiliar ground with a methodical curiosity that came from understanding how to interpret the landscape. Fields shaped by years of farming, winding forest paths, and shifting shadows beneath the trees all resembled environments they had navigated long before setting foot in Europe. At the headquarters level, senior American officers began analyzing what elements of the training program were producing the quickest improvements. They noted that recruits responded exceptionally well to scenarios requiring independent judgment. Instead of treating soldiers as interchangeable units, instructors encouraged each individual to understand how their decisions fit into the broader objective. This approach created a sense of personal accountability that made every soldier aware of how their actions could influence the entire operation. Kerr remembered one moment from training when an instructor placed 3 wooden markers at different angles on a hillside. Instead of instructing the class to follow a single path, he asked each recruit to choose their own angle of approach and explain the reasoning behind it. At the time, Kerr found the exercise puzzling. It lacked the rigid structure he expected from military training. Only later did he realize that the instructor was preparing them to trust their own reasoning, especially in moments when waiting for instructions would cost valuable time. This mindset resurfaced frequently as the squad moved through the French countryside. During one particularly challenging stretch of forest, the squad encountered a narrow ravine where fallen logs crisscrossed unevenly. The terrain offered limited visibility, and sound echoed strangely between the steep walls. Rather than forcing a straight path forward, Kerr suggested using the higher ground along the right side, where the slope provided a clearer view of the surrounding area. His squad followed without hesitation, recognizing that these subtle adjustments often prevented unexpected encounters. As they moved upward, they noticed signs of recent activity, impressions in the soil, a disturbed patch of leaves, faint footprints leading toward a concealed position behind a moss-covered stump. The squad paused, maintaining quiet focus. Their calm reaction demonstrated how deeply the training had shaped their sense of timing. Instead of reacting with alarm or moving too quickly, they remained steady, observing the area patiently before continuing forward. Throughout the region, other American units reported similar experiences. Soldiers described moments where their intuition, shaped by training and personal experience, helped them navigate complex areas with remarkable clarity. Officers documented these accounts, recognizing that the American system of preparation had created a level of consistency that exceeded expectations. What made this particularly striking was that many of these troops were relatively new to the theater, yet they performed with a level of confidence typically associated with more experienced forces. German forces, meanwhile, grew increasingly aware that their assumptions about the American army were no longer valid. Reports from German field officers described the Americans as surprisingly deliberate and noted their ability to remain composed under pressure. Instead of responding to unexpected challenges with confusion, they adapted steadily, adjusting their formations and maintaining momentum even when faced with unfavorable terrain. One German lieutenant, observing through binoculars from a ridge overlooking a shallow valley, wrote in his report that the Americans moved with the assurance of people who have practiced this path many times, though they must be new to the region. His words captured the essence of what the Germans found most unsettling. The Americans were not acting like inexperienced troops, and their adaptability made it difficult to anticipate their movements. Kerr and his squad continued their advance with the same rhythm that had guided them since their arrival. During pauses, they expanded their understanding of the terrain, taking mental notes of gentle slopes, scattered rocks, and lines of trees that could offer natural guidance. Instructors had taught them to treat every environment as a potential map rather than a threat, a concept that had become second nature. When the squad reached an open plain bordered by a cluster of abandoned farm buildings, their sergeant motioned for them to spread out along a natural curve in the ground. The formation allowed them to approach cautiously while maintaining visibility of the windows and doors ahead. The plain itself was quiet, but the worn paths in the earth suggested it had been recently traversed. Without exchanging many words, the squad proceeded, each member adjusting their speed subtly to keep pace with the others. This seamless coordination was not something they consciously attempted. It was the result of training that prioritized fluidity over formality, the ability to read cues from teammates and respond instinctively. Even when faced with uncertainty, Kerr found reassurance in the familiarity of these patterns. The ease with which the squad adapted to new situations fostered a sense of unity that rarely required spoken instruction. As the campaign progressed, American headquarters compiled data comparing the performance of units with various training backgrounds. They discovered that those with extensive marksmanship instruction consistently advanced more steadily, responded more effectively to unexpected challenges, and maintained higher levels of composure under pressure. These findings reinforced the value of training that emphasized individual skill and judgment rather than relying solely on rigid formations. German High Command took note of this trend. Analysts reviewed reports indicating that the Americans showed strength not just in equipment or numbers but in personal preparation. They debated whether these results stemmed from cultural differences or from the structured training regimen the Americans had implemented. Regardless of the cause, the effects were clear across the front. For soldiers like Kerr, these broader analyses were distant concerns. Their focus remained on the immediate challenges: the shifting wind, the angles of tree branches, the sound of distant footsteps, and the timing of their own breathing. Each moment demanded attention, and every action reflected a blend of instinct and practice. It was in these small details that their confidence thrived. The Germans, facing an opponent who met each challenge with calm precision, began adjusting their expectations. They realized that the Americans would not be easily disoriented and that their adaptability would continue to pose challenges. This recognition influenced strategic decisions at higher levels, where German planners tried to anticipate how the Americans might respond to increasingly complex situations. Despite the mounting pressure on both sides, Kerr and his squad remained committed to their steady progression. Their advance through the countryside continued to demonstrate the effectiveness of training that emphasized personal responsibility and quiet confidence. As they prepared to move into new terrain, they carried with them the lessons instilled through months of thoughtful instruction, lessons that would guide them through increasingly demanding operations. The campaign entered a phase where terrain became increasingly varied, shifting from open fields and rolling hills to more intricate patches of forest, narrow villages, and winding riverbanks. For the Americans, this variation didn't slow momentum. Instead, it offered new opportunities to apply the adaptable skills they had been cultivating. Units that had grown accustomed to making independent adjustments thrived in these unpredictable environments, while forces that relied on rigid formations struggled to maintain cohesion. Private Kerr found that each new landscape presented a fresh set of considerations. In one region, tall grasses swayed in the wind, creating patterns that revealed subtle movements. In another, low stone fences divided fields into irregular shapes, offering both cover and potential obstacles. Kerr drew from his upbringing in Colorado, where the land demanded constant awareness. He recognized familiar markers, shifts in soil texture, the alignment of bushes along natural drainage paths, and the way distant sounds traveled across different surfaces. One morning, his squad approached a wooded area where sunlight filtered through the branches in narrow beams. The play of light created pockets of brightness and darkness where visibility could be deceiving. Instead of rushing into the shade or avoiding the brighter areas, the squad used the variations to their advantage. Kerr scanned the subtle transitions between shadow and light, noting where movement would appear most naturally. Their training had emphasized reading contrast rather than relying solely on fixed markers, and this approach allowed them to identify signs of activity long before reaching the trees. German soldiers positioned within the woods had expected the Americans to approach with caution, slowing down as they entered the shaded areas. Instead, they saw a group navigating with practiced awareness, adjusting their spacing and pace fluidly. The Americans moved with a confidence that drew the attention of German officers observing from elevated positions. To them, it seemed as though the Americans anticipated movement before it happened, a perception that created an air of unpredictability around their approach. As the Americans progressed further into the woods, Kerr noticed faint disturbances in the underbrush, the kind that revealed recent passage. He motioned to the soldier beside him, and the squad angled slightly to take advantage of a narrow, elevated ridge that offered a clear line of sight. It was these kinds of subtle adjustments that allowed the Americans to maintain momentum even when navigating complex landscapes. The value of adaptability became even clearer during an afternoon operation near a series of shallow marshes. The ground here was soft, and movement required careful timing to avoid sinking unexpectedly. Kerr remembered childhood experiences crossing creek beds where similar conditions required careful foot placement. He guided the squad along a slightly raised path where the soil was firmer and the vegetation thicker. These small, informed choices enabled them to progress steadily without drawing unnecessary attention or causing delays. Reports from other American units described similar experiences. Soldiers noted how their training prepared them to interpret unfamiliar environments quickly, allowing them to respond effectively to sudden challenges. This adaptability began to influence how commanders approached their planning. They realized that many soldiers were capable of navigating terrain independently without compromising the unit's overall strategy. This realization allowed officers to refine their expectations and take advantage of the Americans' capacity for flexible decision-making. German observers continued to voice their concerns in written reports. One officer noted that American troops do not appear hesitant, even when entering areas traditionally considered difficult for inexperienced soldiers. Another remarked that American riflemen handle their surroundings as though familiar with them, suggesting a level of environmental awareness that exceeded typical expectations. These observations fed into a growing belief that the Americans possessed a kind of natural ease with their tasks, a perspective shaped by the combination of cultural familiarity with outdoor environments and structured instruction emphasizing personal judgment. Kerr and his squad noticed hints of these shifting perceptions indirectly. Captured maps and notes occasionally revealed how the Germans planned to slow American advances by using terrain to their advantage. Yet time and time again, these efforts were less effective than expected. The Americans found ways to interpret the terrain in ways that reduced the intended impact of German obstacles. This consistency frustrated German planners and encouraged American commanders, who increasingly relied on the steady performance of their riflemen. As the squad approached a river crossing one afternoon, they encountered a partially collapsed wooden footbridge. Instead of viewing this as a hindrance, they analyzed the structure for stability, testing the sections that remained intact. Their training had included improvisation exercises where soldiers used limited materials to navigate obstacles. The squad worked together to identify a safe path across the water, using both the bridge remnants and natural stones protruding from the shallow current. Their ability to adapt allowed them to cross efficiently, maintaining the pace of the overall operation. The success of such maneuvers contributed to a growing sense of unity within the American ranks. Soldiers recognized that their individual choices played a meaningful role in the progress of their unit. This understanding reinforced their sense of responsibility and encouraged them to remain attentive in all situations. While the challenges varied, their training provided a foundation that allowed them to respond confidently. German analysts continued to compile their observations, attempting to determine the underlying cause of the American success. They debated whether cultural background or formal training played the larger role. Some argued that the Americans' familiarity with outdoor environments gave them an advantage in reading terrain. Others believed that the structure of American training instilled habits that encouraged adaptability. Regardless of the origin, all agreed that the Americans displayed a level of consistent awareness that made them unusually effective competitors. For Kerr, these broad discussions were far removed from the immediate tasks at hand. His focus remained on the moment-to-moment decisions required to move safely through each environment. He continued to draw from both his personal experiences and the refined skills taught by his instructors. The combination allowed him to remain calm even when the terrain shifted unexpectedly. As the Americans prepared to enter yet another stretch of challenging countryside, the confidence they carried was not rooted in bravado but in familiarity. Familiarity with their training, their instincts, and the landscapes that unfolded before them. This consistency made them increasingly reliable as the campaign advanced, creating momentum that would carry them through the next stages of the operation with the same quiet determination that had defined their journey thus far. The shifting landscape of northern France introduced new variables that tested even the most experienced soldiers. River valleys dotted with thick fog in the early hours, narrow stone alleyways winding through quiet towns, and stretches of open hillsides where wind patterns influenced sound, all presented challenges that required constant awareness. Yet the Americans continued to adapt with a sense of ease that drew attention from both sides of the conflict. Private Kerr's squad approached each new environment with the same careful observation that had guided them through previous regions. During one morning advance along a ridge overlooking a patchwork of farmland, they encountered a series of terraced fields bordered by low walls. These walls, though modest in height, created a network of blind spots. Instead of walking directly across the terraces, Kerr suggested following the contours of the hillside, allowing the squad to maintain visibility of each section before entering it. This approach ensured that surprises were minimal and that the squad retained control over their movement. The terrain soon transitioned into a wooded section where the density of trees limited visibility. The squad paused, listening for any signs of activity. Instructors had emphasized the importance of auditory awareness, teaching soldiers how to distinguish between natural sounds, wind through branches, small animals crossing undergrowth, and signs of human movement. After a moment of quiet observation, Kerr identified a faint rustling that didn't match the rhythm of the wind. His squad adjusted formation, moving in staggered positions that allowed them to maintain sight lines while advancing cautiously. German soldiers within the woods had anticipated that the Americans would approach hesitantly, slowing their pace to navigate the difficult environment. Instead, they observed a group moving with deliberate calm, pausing only long enough to assess the area before progressing. The Germans had placed markers along the trees to help coordinate their own movements, but the Americans seemed to navigate without needing such aids. This ability unsettled the German observers, who found it difficult to predict the Americans' behavior when they encountered unfamiliar terrain. As the squad reached the edge of the forest, the land opened into a shallow valley dotted with small cottages. Smoke drifted gently from a few chimneys, suggesting recent occupation. The squad remained cautious, using the natural curves of the land for cover. Kerr noted the arrangement of the cottages, recognizing that certain angles provided better visibility than others. He motioned for his squad to approach from a direction that offered a clear view of the front entrances while keeping the windows in sight. Inside one of the cottages, German soldiers noticed the Americans' approach. They had expected their opponents to walk directly into the central lane, where visibility was poor. Instead, the Americans positioned themselves with precision, choosing angles that favored observation over exposure. This strategic awareness demonstrated the effectiveness of their training and further reinforced the Germans' growing concern. As the Americans continued through the valley, their progress attracted the attention of senior Allied commanders reviewing the day's reports. They noted the consistency with which American riflemen responded to varied conditions. Many officers expressed admiration for the adaptability demonstrated at the squad and platoon levels, recognizing that this ability to adjust contributed significantly to the overall success of operations. Kerr's squad experienced a brief pause in their advance as they reached a small stream. The water flowed steadily, and the banks were lined with smooth stones that made footing uncertain. Kerr knelt to inspect the stones, noting which sections appeared stable. He guided the squad across using a natural curve in the streambed where the water was shallowest. This moment highlighted how even simple tasks required careful observation, a skill that had become second nature to him. Meanwhile, German analysts continued to examine American behavior. They noted that the Americans often made decisions based on subtle environmental cues that might go unnoticed by less experienced soldiers. German reports frequently described the Americans as displaying a kind of innate calmness, reacting to unexpected situations with deliberate assessment rather than panic. This observation led some German officers to consider whether the Americans were trained differently or simply inclined toward independent action. American commanders, however, understood the true nature of their soldiers' performance. They recognized that the training program, which emphasized individual judgment, had created soldiers capable of making informed decisions in real time. This approach contrasted with the more rigid systems used by some European armies, where strict adherence to orders could hinder rapid adaptation. The Americans' ability to combine natural familiarity with structured training produced a level of flexibility that proved especially valuable in the unpredictable conditions of the front. Kerr reflected on this dynamic during brief rest periods between movements. Though he didn't often think consciously about the structure of his training, he recognized that the exercises had prepared him to interpret the environment quickly. He remembered days spent practicing small adjustments, shifting a stance to balance on uneven ground, controlling breathing to maintain steady aim, and analyzing the position of trees or rocks to determine the best path. These skills, though subtle, now guided his actions consistently. As the squad prepared to move into another wooded region, they reviewed the terrain ahead. The land sloped gently downward toward a river that curved through the forest. Instructors had taught them to anticipate how sound traveled differently near water, and Kerr used this knowledge to determine the best approach. The squad moved with quiet confidence, their coordinated footsteps blending into the soft earth. German observers stationed along the riverbank noticed the Americans' progress with growing unease. They had attempted to use the river's natural acoustics to mask their movements, expecting the Americans to struggle with the shifting sounds. Yet the Americans appeared to navigate with familiarity, adjusting their pace to match the ambient noise of the flowing water. The broader implications of these observations reverberated throughout German command posts. Officers questioned how the Americans had developed such consistency so quickly. Some speculated that the United States had drawn heavily from its rural population, resulting in soldiers who were inherently comfortable in outdoor environments. Others argued that American instructors must have implemented an innovative training system. Regardless of the explanation, it was evident that the Americans possessed a level of adaptability that challenged traditional expectations. This realization influenced tactical decisions on both sides as the campaign continued to unfold. For the Americans, their steady performance encouraged commanders to pursue more ambitious objectives. For the Germans, it prompted adjustments in planning as they sought new ways to slow an opponent who refused to be easily deterred. The Americans pushed forward with unwavering resolve, their movements guided by a combination of instinct and instruction. As the next phase of operations approached, Kerr and his squad carried with them the lessons that had shaped their journey, lessons that would continue to guide them through the evolving landscapes ahead. As autumn deepened across the French countryside, the landscapes evolved once more, offering a fresh range of challenges. The shifting colors of the season brought new patterns of light and shadow, while unpredictable winds altered how sound moved through wooded areas and open fields. For the American forces, these changes introduced another layer of complexity. Yet the soldiers approached each adjustment with the same composed awareness that had characterized their earlier efforts. Private Kerr found himself increasingly attuned to these seasonal nuances. During one afternoon advanced through a gently sloping valley, he noticed how fallen leaves created a patchwork of textures that revealed subtle movement. The wind occasionally stirred clusters of leaves, but the rhythm of natural motion remained distinct. When Kerr observed a disruption in that rhythm, a slight separation of leaves where none should have occurred, he signaled for his squad to adjust their direction. The squad responded fluidly, illustrating how their training and experience had merged into seamless coordination. German observers stationed in elevated positions took note of how the Americans handled these seasonal challenges. They documented that the Americans rarely hesitated when confronted with unfamiliar conditions. Instead, they adapted quickly, interpreting the environment with a level of confidence that suggested extensive preparation. To the Germans, this behavior seemed almost instinctual, reinforcing the perception that their opponents possessed a natural ease with the terrain. The Americans' growing proficiency influenced how Allied commanders planned their movements. Officers recognized that units like Kerr's could handle shifting conditions effectively, allowing them to pursue more complex maneuvers. This trust in the adaptability of their troops enabled the Allies to capitalize on opportunities that might have been deemed too risky earlier in the campaign. One morning, Kerr's squad approached a small hillside village where the narrow streets curved unpredictably between stone buildings. These structures, with their varying heights and irregular placement, created a network of blind spots. Instead of walking directly into the center of the village, the squad moved along the periphery, using low walls and doorways to control their visibility. This measured approach allowed them to assess the environment before entering the central lane. Inside the village, a few remaining residents watched quietly from their doorways. Though the presence of civilians added a layer of complexity, the squad maintained the same composed awareness that guided them through the countryside. The Americans' calm demeanor reassured the villagers, who had become accustomed to uncertainty and tension. Kerr offered brief, polite gestures as they passed, acknowledging the civilians' presence without disrupting the squad's focus. As they ventured deeper into the village, the squad noticed faint signs of recent movement, footprints along the edges of the street, a door left slightly ajar, and items that appeared newly relocated. These subtle indicators suggested that German forces may have passed through recently. Instead of reacting with alarm, the squad adopted a tighter formation and continued their methodical progress. German officers later reviewing notes from this region expressed surprise at how gracefully the Americans navigated populated areas. They had assumed that inexperienced troops would struggle to maintain composure in environments where civilian presence and structural complexity created additional variables. Instead, the Americans demonstrated the same level of awareness they displayed in open fields or forests. Kerr attributed this composure to the grounding principles of his training. Instructors had emphasized treating each environment with the same deliberate attention, regardless of how familiar or foreign it appeared. This mindset encouraged soldiers to focus on the underlying patterns of movement, sound, and structure rather than becoming overwhelmed by superficial details. After leaving the village, the squad followed a dirt path that wound uphill toward a small plateau. From this vantage point, the surrounding landscape unfolded in a wide panorama of rolling hills and scattered forests. Kerr studied the terrain, noting possible routes for movement and areas where the land dipped slightly, natural features that could provide cover or vantage points. His squad paused to rest briefly, using the time to observe the subtle shifts in the landscape as clouds drifted overhead. German analysts continued to document their observations of American behavior. Some noted that the Americans appeared to anticipate terrain-based challenges before encountering them, adjusting their pace and formation preemptively. This foresight puzzled the Germans, who were accustomed to seeing new forces react rather than anticipate. The Americans' ability to interpret their surroundings with such clarity created a sense of unpredictability for their opponents. American commanders, meanwhile, refined their strategies to harness the strengths of their adaptable riflemen. They adjusted their expectations to allow for more flexible decision-making at lower levels, trusting that soldiers like Kerr could make informed choices in real time. This shift in leadership philosophy reflected a growing belief that adaptability was not merely an individual trait but a valuable asset that could shape the outcome of larger operations. Kerr's squad encountered a particularly challenging environment as they approached a region of shallow ravines and narrow ridgelines. The varied elevations created complex acoustics, with sound traveling in unexpected ways. The squad moved cautiously, using hand signals to communicate. Kerr studied the ridgelines, determining which slopes offered the most stable footing and clearest lines of sight. His decisions guided the squad through the terrain with steady precision. German observers watching from distant positions remarked that the Americans maintained a remarkable sense of calm even in areas where conditions shifted rapidly. They documented instances where American units altered their formation mid-movement to adapt to changing terrain, a level of fluidity that challenged traditional assumptions about infantry behavior. As the squad advanced further, Kerr noticed a series of flat stones arranged in a pattern that suggested recent human activity. He pointed it out to his squad leader, who adjusted the squad's course to investigate cautiously. This attention to detail was a testament to the instructors who had taught them to analyze their surroundings with intention rather than haste. Throughout the region, other American units reported similar experiences, reinforcing the perception that the Americans' adaptability stemmed from a combination of cultural familiarity with outdoor environments and structured training that encouraged independent judgment. This dynamic played a crucial role in maintaining momentum as the campaign entered its next stages. With each passing day, Kerr and his squad approached new challenges with the same measured confidence that had defined their earlier progress. Their ability to interpret the environment and respond effectively allowed them to continue moving forward with purpose, setting the stage for the next phase of operations. As the campaign pressed on, the Americans encountered increasingly complex terrain. Rolling hills transitioned into deep forests and winding waterways, requiring soldiers to apply their skills with even greater precision. Yet the Americans continued to adapt with the same quiet determination that had become their hallmark. Reports from across the front describe how American units handled these challenges with grace, maintaining a steady pace even when faced with unfamiliar conditions. Private Kerr's squad approached each new environment with a sense of calm curiosity. During one afternoon march through a forest where the trees grew densely together, the squad moved slowly, taking care to interpret the subtle cues around them. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the canopy in scattered patterns, illuminating patches of forest floor. These shifting patches created a mosaic of light and shadow that could easily distort perception, yet Kerr and his squad maintained steady focus. At one point, Kerr noticed a subtle change in the distribution of leaves near a cluster of roots, a faint sign that the ground had been disturbed recently. He raised his hand, signaling the squad to pause. The squad leader nodded, adjusting their route slightly to avoid the disturbed area. This small, informed decision reflected how deeply environmental awareness had become embedded within the squad's behavior. German soldiers, positioned within the forest, observed the Americans with increasing concern. They noted how the Americans avoided obvious paths in favor of natural contours, choosing routes that minimized exposure. This strategic awareness suggested a level of training that exceeded traditional expectations. German analysts documented these observations, noting that the Americans displayed a remarkable ability to interpret their surroundings quickly. For the Americans, moving through the forest required a series of small adjustments, controlling breathing to remain quiet, shifting stances to avoid breaking twigs, and maintaining steady awareness of light and shadow. Each action aligned with their training, which had emphasized the importance of understanding how terrain influenced movement and visibility. As they emerged from the forest, the squad encountered a steep incline. The hillside, covered in loose soil and scattered rocks, required careful foot placement. Kerr led the way, choosing a path that followed natural ridges where the soil was more compact. The squad advanced steadily, using the slope to their advantage. Once they reached the top, they paused briefly to assess the land below. From this vantage point, they could see a wide expanse of open fields bordered by low stone fences and clusters of trees. The positioning of these elements created a natural mosaic of cover and potential obstacles. Kerr studied the terrain, identifying a route that allowed the squad to move through the fields while maintaining visibility of critical angles. German analysts continued to observe how the Americans navigated these spaces. They noted that American riflemen often positioned themselves in ways that allowed them to maintain lines of sight even when advancing through areas where visibility was limited. This behavior contrasted with the more rigid formations used by some other armies, highlighting the Americans' adaptability. As the squad moved across the fields, a gentle breeze rustled the grasses, creating a soft, rhythmic sound. The wind patterns allowed Kerr to distinguish between natural movement and signs of activity. When he noticed a slight break in the rhythm near a cluster of bushes, he motioned for the squad to adjust direction. These small decisions, made with confidence, allowed the squad to maintain control of their environment. German officers reviewing reports from this region expressed increasing concern about the Americans' ability to maintain momentum in varied terrain. They noted that the Americans rarely hesitated, even when encountering complex or ambiguous conditions. This consistent adaptability made it difficult for German forces to predict their movements. American commanders, meanwhile, refined their strategies to harness the strengths of their adaptable troops. They recognized that squads like Kerr's could navigate complex environments without requiring extensive oversight. This trust in the soldiers' abilities allowed commanders to assign more ambitious objectives, confident that their troops could handle the challenges ahead. Kerr reflected on this dynamic during brief rest periods between movements. He recognized that the training he had received had prepared him to interpret the environment with clarity. He remembered exercises that emphasized steady breathing, controlled movement, and thoughtful observation. These skills, though subtle, had become foundational to his approach. As the squad prepared to move into another series of wooded areas, they reviewed a map that outlined the terrain ahead. The map showed a series of ridges, valleys, and winding paths. Kerr studied the elevation lines, noting how the land shaped movement. His understanding of terrain, developed through personal experience and refined through training, allowed him to anticipate the challenges they would encounter. German observers stationed in this region documented the Americans' approach with growing unease. They noted that the Americans seemed to understand how the terrain influenced both sound and movement, adjusting their pace accordingly. This level of awareness made it difficult for German forces to catch the Americans off guard. As the squad advanced into the wooded areas, they encountered a series of winding paths where visibility was limited. Kerr guided the squad along a route that offered the most consistent sightlines, allowing them to maintain awareness of their surroundings. The squad moved with steady precision, responding to subtle cues in the environment. German analysts continued to document these observations, noting that the Americans demonstrated a level of control that exceeded traditional expectations for newly deployed troops. They attributed this to a combination of cultural familiarity with outdoor environments and structured training that emphasized adaptability. For Kerr, each new challenge reinforced the value of the skills he had learned. The ability to interpret terrain, control his breathing, and make informed decisions had become second nature. As the squad continued their journey, they carried these lessons with them, prepared to navigate the evolving landscapes ahead. As the American advance moved further into contested territory, the terrain continued to change in ways that required steady awareness. Meadows gave way to narrow canyons, and quiet villages gave way to winding riverbanks lined with dense vegetation. Each new environment required the soldiers to apply their training in slightly different ways, yet the Americans adapted with the same calm precision that had characterized their earlier efforts. Private Kerr's squad approached each new region with a sense of quiet curiosity. During one morning march along a riverbank, the squad encountered a series of low, rounded boulders that created natural stepping points along the water's edge. The constant sound of flowing water created a rhythmic backdrop, making it difficult to distinguish between natural and human-made noises. Kerr knelt briefly, listening intently. He recognized the subtle shift in sound that indicated movement on the opposite bank. Instead of reacting abruptly, the squad adjusted their formation, spreading out along the riverbank to maintain visibility. Kerr motioned toward a cluster of trees that offered a stable vantage point. From this position, they could observe the opposite bank without exposing themselves. Their measured approach reflected the calm composure that had become second nature to them. German soldiers stationed along the riverbank observed the Americans' movements with growing concern. They had expected the Americans to approach cautiously, struggling to navigate the challenging terrain. Instead, they watched a group that moved with deliberate confidence, using natural features to their advantage. German analysts documented these observations, noting that the Americans seemed unusually comfortable interpreting the environment. As the squad moved further along the river, they encountered a shallow crossing where the water flowed gently over smooth stones. Kerr tested the depth with his boot, noting the stability of the stones beneath the surface. He guided the squad across using a diagonal path that minimized exposure. The squad crossed with steady control, maintaining their formation throughout the maneuver. On the opposite bank, they found a series of narrow paths leading up a hillside. The incline was steep, and the soil was loose in places. Kerr led the way, choosing footholds that offered the most stability. His familiarity with similar terrain from his youth allowed him to make confident decisions, guiding the squad upward with steady determination. German officers reviewing reports from this region noted that the Americans displayed a remarkable ability to maintain composure even in difficult environments. They documented examples of American units adjusting their pace to match the terrain, using natural features to maintain visibility and control. This level of adaptability challenged traditional expectations and forced German planners to reconsider how to counter the Americans' steady advance. American commanders recognized the value of this adaptability. They adjusted their strategies to take advantage of the Americans' ability to navigate complex environments without requiring extensive supervision. This trust in their troops allowed them to pursue more ambitious objectives, confident that units like Kerr's could handle the challenges ahead. Kerr's squad encountered a new challenge as they approached a series of narrow canyons. The walls of the canyons rose steeply on either side, creating limited visibility and unpredictable acoustics. The squad moved cautiously, using hand signals to communicate. Kerr studied the patterns of light filtering through the canyon walls, noting which areas offered the most consistent footing. The squad maintained a steady pace, adjusting their movements to match the contours of the canyon. Kerr's understanding of terrain allowed him to anticipate shifts in the environment, guiding the squad through narrow passages with calm precision. The Germans observing from nearby positions noted how seamlessly the Americans adapted to the complex environment. Following the canyon, the squad emerged into a large clearing bordered by tall grasses and scattered trees. The open space allowed them to regain visibility of the surrounding area. Kerr noted the subtle shifts in the grass that indicated changes in the wind. This awareness allowed the squad to adjust their formation, maintaining control of their environment. German analysts continued to document these observations, noting that the Americans displayed a level of environmental awareness that exceeded traditional expectations. They attributed this to a combination of cultural familiarity with outdoor environments and structured training that emphasized adaptability. This analysis reinforced the perception that the Americans possessed a kind of natural ease with the terrain. As the squad prepared to move into a series of rolling hills, they reviewed a map that outlined the terrain ahead. The map showed a combination of open fields, wooded areas, and winding paths. Kerr studied the elevation lines, noting how the land shaped movement. His understanding of terrain allowed him to anticipate the challenges they would encounter, guiding the squad with steady confidence. The Germans, facing an opponent who remained composed even in challenging environments, adjusted their expectations. They recognized that the Americans' adaptability made it difficult to predict their movements. This realization influenced strategic decisions on both sides, shaping the next phase of the campaign. Kerr's squad continued their journey with unwavering resolve, carrying with them the skills and experiences that had shaped their progress. Their ability to interpret the environment with clarity and respond effectively to challenges allowed them to maintain momentum as they moved into the next stage of operations. As the campaign entered its later stages, the Americans faced a new series of obstacles that tested their adaptability. The terrain became increasingly unpredictable, shifting between dense forests, rocky outcroppings, and narrow valleys. Yet the Americans continued to demonstrate the same steady awareness that had defined their progress from the beginning. Private Kerr's squad approached each environment with a sense of deliberate curiosity. During one afternoon march through a region dotted with large boulders and uneven cliffs, the squad moved carefully, using the natural rock formations for cover. The rugged terrain required constant attention to foot placement and line of sight. Kerr studied the shapes of the boulders, noting which angles offered the best visibility. His familiarity with similar terrain from his youth allowed him to make informed decisions, guiding the squad with calm precision. German observers stationed on nearby ridges watched the Americans' progress with increasing concern. They noted how the Americans used the terrain to their advantage, positioning themselves in ways that maximized visibility and minimized exposure. This behavior suggested a level of training that surpassed traditional expectations for newly deployed troops. As the squad moved further into the rocky region, they encountered a series of narrow passageways between the cliffs. The tight spaces required careful maneuvering, and the acoustics of the area made it difficult to distinguish between natural echoes and signs of movement. Kerr guided the squad slowly, using hand signals to communicate. His understanding of terrain allowed him to anticipate shifts in the environment, helping the squad maintain control of their surroundings. German analysts continued to document these observations, noting that the Americans displayed a level of environmental awareness that challenged traditional assumptions about infantry behavior. They attributed this to a combination of cultural familiarity with outdoor environments and structured training that emphasized individual judgment. American commanders recognized the value of this adaptability. They adjusted their strategies to take advantage of the Americans' ability to navigate complex environments without requiring extensive supervision. This trust in their troops allowed them to pursue more ambitious objectives, confident that units like Kerr's could handle the challenges ahead. One day, the squad approached a small plateau that offered a wide view of the surrounding countryside. From this vantage point, they could see a series of winding paths that led through a region of gentle hills and shallow valleys. Kerr studied the terrain, noting the subtle shifts in the land that shaped movement. His understanding of the environment allowed him to determine the best route for the squad to follow. German officers reviewing reports from this region noted that the Americans displayed a remarkable ability to maintain composure even in difficult environments. They documented examples of American units adjusting their pace to match the terrain, using natural features to maintain visibility and control. This level of adaptability challenged traditional expectations and forced German planners to reconsider how to counter the Americans' steady advance. As the squad descended from the plateau, they entered a region where the land sloped gently toward a river. The riverbank was lined with tall grasses that swayed in the breeze, creating a rhythmic pattern that allowed Kerr to distinguish between natural movement and signs of activity. His awareness of these subtle cues allowed the squad to adjust their course, maintaining control of their environment. German observers stationed along the riverbank noted how the Americans responded to these cues with calm precision. They documented instances where the Americans made informed decisions based on subtle environmental cues, demonstrating a level of awareness that exceeded traditional expectations. American commanders, recognizing the value of this adaptability, refined their strategies to take advantage of the Americans' ability to navigate complex environments. They allowed units like Kerr's to operate with greater autonomy, confident that their soldiers could make informed decisions in real time. Kerr reflected on this dynamic during brief rest periods between movements. He recognized that the training he had received had prepared him to interpret the environment with clarity. He remembered exercises that emphasized steady breathing, controlled movement, and thoughtful observation. These skills, though subtle, had become foundational to his approach. As the squad prepared to move into another series of wooded areas, they reviewed a map that outlined the terrain ahead. The map showed a combination of open fields, wooded areas, and winding paths. Kerr studied the elevation lines, noting how the land shaped movement. His understanding of terrain allowed him to anticipate the challenges they would encounter, guiding the squad with steady confidence. German analysts continued to document these observations, noting that the Americans demonstrated a level of control that exceeded traditional expectations for newly deployed troops. They attributed this to a combination of cultural familiarity with outdoor environments and structured training that emphasized adaptability. As the squad advanced into the wooded areas, they encountered a series of winding paths where visibility was limited. Kerr guided the squad along a route that offered the most consistent sightlines, allowing them to maintain awareness of their surroundings. The squad moved with steady precision, responding to subtle cues in the environment. These carefully informed decisions continued to shape the Americans' progress as they entered the final stages of the campaign. Their adaptability and awareness provided a steady foundation for the challenges that lay ahead. By the final weeks of the campaign, the Americans had established a reputation among both allies and opponents for their remarkable adaptability. Reports from across the front describe how American units navigated diverse environments with calm precision, applying their training in ways that consistently influenced the outcome of operations. German analysts noted that the Americans displayed a level of environmental awareness that challenged traditional expectations, while American commanders recognized the value of their soldiers' ability to make informed decisions in real time. Private Kerr's squad continued to advance with the same steady confidence that had defined their earlier efforts. In one region, they encountered a series of gentle hills covered with dense grasses and scattered shrubs. The wind patterns created subtle shifts that allowed Kerr to distinguish between natural movement and signs of activity. He guided the squad through the hills with deliberate awareness, using the natural contours of the land to maintain visibility and control. German observers stationed on nearby ridges documented the Americans' movements with growing concern. They noted how the Americans adjusted their pace to match the environment, moving with deliberate control. This behavior suggested a level of training that exceeded traditional expectations for newly deployed troops. As the squad approached a region of rolling fields and narrow winding paths, Kerr studied the terrain, noting the subtle shifts that shaped movement. His understanding of terrain allowed him to determine the best route for the squad to follow. The squad moved with steady precision, responding to subtle cues in the environment. American commanders recognized the value of this adaptability. They refined their strategies to harness the strengths of their adaptable troops, allowing units like Kerr's to operate with greater autonomy. This trust in their soldiers' abilities allowed them to pursue more ambitious objectives, confident that their troops could handle the challenges ahead. Kerr reflected on this dynamic during brief rest periods between movements. He recognized that the training he had received had prepared him to interpret the environment with clarity. He remembered exercises that emphasized steady breathing, controlled movement, and thoughtful observation. These skills, though subtle, had become foundational to his approach. The squad encountered a new challenge as they approached a region of narrow valleys and scattered trees. The shifting terrain required careful observation, and the squad moved with deliberate control. Kerr guided them along a route that offered the most consistent visibility, using natural features to maintain control of their environment. German analysts continued to document their observations, noting that the Americans displayed a level of control that exceeded traditional expectations. They attributed this to a combination of cultural familiarity with outdoor environments and structured training that emphasized adaptability. As the squad prepared to enter a region of dense forest, they reviewed a map that outlined the terrain ahead. The map showed a combination of narrow paths, steep inclines, and scattered clearings. Kerr studied the terrain carefully, noting how the land shaped movement. His understanding of terrain allowed him to anticipate the challenges they would encounter, guiding the squad with steady confidence. Inside the forest, the shifting light created a mosaic of brightness and shadow. The squad moved carefully, using hand signals to communicate. Kerr's awareness of subtle environmental cues allowed him to guide the squad effectively, responding to the shifting conditions with calm precision. German observers stationed in elevated positions noted how the Americans navigated the forest with deliberate awareness. They documented instances where the Americans adjusted their pace to match the environment, responding to subtle shifts in light and sound. This level of adaptability made it difficult for German forces to anticipate their movements. American commanders recognized the value of this adaptability. They continued to refine their strategies to harness the strengths of their troops, trusting that units like Kerr's could navigate complex environments effectively. As the squad emerged from the forest into a wide clearing, Kerr took a moment to appreciate the landscape. The rolling hills, winding paths, and scattered trees had become familiar markers. He recognized that the training he had received had prepared him to interpret these environments with clarity, guiding him through each challenge with steady confidence. The campaign continued, and Kerr's squad remained committed to their efforts, applying their training in ways that shaped the success of operations. Their ability to interpret the environment with clarity and respond effectively to challenges allowed them to maintain momentum as they moved into the final stages of the campaign. Through their steady progress, the Americans demonstrated the value of adaptability, awareness, and deliberate action. They showed that the combination of cultural familiarity with outdoor environments and structured training that emphasized individual judgment had created a new standard for infantry performance. As the campaign drew to a close, the Americans carried with them the lessons that had shaped their journey, lessons that would influence military training for generations to come.